Okay, this is chapter 3 of The Pharaohs of Ancient Egypt by Elizabeth Payne. Chapter 3, The Good God, Pharaoh Cheops, from about 2756 BC to about 2553 BC. That is our title. Okay, here we go. About 450 years before Christ was born, the Greek historian Herodotus paid a lengthy visit to the land of Egypt. He stayed for a time in Memphis, the ancient capital of the pharaohs, and while there, he went with a group of Egyptian priests to view one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The pyramid rose hugely from the flat desert near Memphis, a perfectly proportioned mountain of stone as high as a modern 40-story skyscraper. South of it, a line of smaller pyramids stretched for more than 60 miles along the banks of the Nile. Like Giza, each was the tomb of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh or his queen. Herodotus stood bareheaded and mute beneath Giza's towering sides. Nothing in all his travels had prepared him for such a sight. More than 2 million blocks of granite, each averaging about 2.5 tons in weight, had gone into making this giant structure. Its sides were covered with polished limestone, as smooth. We'll see what that says next. This is the giant sphinx at Giza, right here. Pretty well preserved overall, but they've done some restoration work recently to restore the feet of it. So anyways, its sides were covered with polished limestone, as smooth as glass. And at its peak, a golden capstone flashed and gleamed like a beacon in the bright sunlight. Giza, the priests told Herodotus, had been the tomb of Pharaoh Cheops, who had ruled Egypt more than 2,000 years earlier. Deep within the body of the pyramid, a series of secret passageways led to the king's chamber. There stood the red granite sarcophagus, or stone coffin, that contained Cheops's mummy. Around it were grouped riches beyond imagining, caskets of jewels, ebony furniture inlaid with ivory and gold, silver and alabaster bowls and vessels, chests of clothing and precious ornaments, and jars of food and wine. For Cheops would have need of these things in the next world, just as he had needed them in this. Standing in the triangular-shaped shadow cast by the huge stone tomb, the priests told Herodotus how the pyramid had been built. Herodotus wrote down everything that they said, and what he wrote was read and believed for centuries to come. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte all read the works of the Greek historian, and each in turn, as he stood in awe beneath the Great Pyramid, imagined he could hear the groans of the slaves who had labored under the lash of Cheops's brutal overseers to raise this mighty tomb skyward. For the priests had told Herodotus that when Cheops succeeded to the throne, he, quote, plunged into all manner of wickedness. He closed the temples and forbade the Egyptians to offer sacrifice, compelling them instead to labor one and all in his service, end quote. These are the pyramids of Giza, showing Cheops's tomb in the foreground with Khafren's tomb just behind it. Cheops, the priests went on, commandeered the people of the Nile Valley to build his pyramid for him. He ground them down to the, quote, to the lowest point of misery. 100,000 men labored constantly and were relieved every 3 months by a fresh lot. It took 10 years' oppression of the people to make the causeway for the conveyance of the stones. The pyramid itself was 20 years in building, end quote. Cheops's successor had been just as wicked as he, the priest told Herodotus. In fact, the Egyptians so detest the memory of these kings that they do not much like even to mention their names. Well, Egyptologists are not so sure about all this. When American and European archaeologists first started to work in Egypt around the beginning of the last century, they went directly to the Great Pyramid, both as sightseers and researchers. The huge tomb was some 4,500 years old by then. Its golden pinnacle had long since vanished, and its outer casing of polished limestone had fallen away, or had been carted off by the Arabs for building elsewhere. The Arabs, too, or so it was supposed, had found the secret, blocked-up entrance to the tomb, for it was standing open. And when archaeologists crawled along the eerie inner passageways to the heart of the pyramid, they found the king's chamber had been robbed. The furniture, jewels, and clothing that could have told them so much about Cheops and his times had vanished. More disappointing still, the great red sarcophagus stood empty. Cheops's mummy had disappeared. Like all students of the past, these pioneer archaeologists, too, had read and believed the accounts of Herodotus. But their excavations turned up no evidence that Cheops had been the heartless monster described by the Greek historian. On the contrary, all their findings, meager though they were for this early period, seemed to indicate that Cheops was a, quote, good god, end quote, whose people labored willingly as an act of worship to build a tomb worthy of his greatness. Pharaoh Cheops ruled Egypt from the city of Memphis, which stood at the juncture of Upper and Lower Egypt, about 10 miles upriver from present-day Cairo. The city had been founded by Menes some 450 years earlier to serve as the capital of his new unified land. Nothing remains today of this once bustling and beautiful metropolis. The ancient Egyptians built their tombs and temples of enduring stone, but their houses and the greater part of their cities were constructed of perishable brick. Little remains of them except dust heaps and an occasional crumbling wall. Nonetheless, it is reasonable to suppose that Memphis was much like later Egyptian cities, about which more is known, in slow-to-change Egypt, which built very nearly the same kinds of houses, boats, and temples for more than 3,000 years. It is unlikely that early cities differed radically from those built later on. If this is so, it is safe to give a description of what Pharaoh Cheops' thriving capital must have been like. Memphis stood on the banks of the slow-moving Nile. Stone docks lined its busy waterfront, which was noisy from sunup to sunset, with the coming and going of river traffic. Little fishing skiffs carrying harpoons to ward off the river's fearsome crocodiles and hippopotamuses skittered about beneath the bows of larger craft. Vegetable barges from the delta maneuvered clumsily into port. Some carried peas, lettuce, and watermelons for the tables of Pharaoh and his nobles. Others brought garlic, radishes, and onions for the Memphis poor. Seagoing ships lay at anchor, their holds laden with cedar wood from distant Lebanon on the eastern Mediterranean coast. For Egypt was rich in every natural resource except building timber, which she had to import. Smaller craft waited their turn to unload the ivory, ebony, ostrich feathers, and gold dust they had brought down river from Nubia, Egypt's neighbor, to the south. On the docks, stevedores sweated and overseers shouted as bellowing livestock and bales of grain were uploaded from barges that had come down river from Upper Egypt. Beyond the cargo boats, the graceful river craft of the nobility rode at anchor, and in a slip of her own lay Pharaoh's great royal barge, her oars shipped and her square red sail furled. Prevailing winds enabled the Egyptians to sail upriver. Coming downriver, they had to row. At the very end of the dockside stood the shipyard, noisy with the sound of hammers, saws, and shouted orders, for this was one of the busiest places in a land whose main highway was its river. And over here is a model of a fishing and fowling skiff found in an Egyptian tomb. The man with the harpoon is poised to spear a river catfish or to frighten off an attacking hippopotamus.
Hippos.
Yep, hippos. Narrow, twisting alleys led back from the docks into a crowded rabbit warren of taverns, mud brick huts, and workshops. Here lived the Memphis poor, her unskilled workers, dockhands, gold and coppersmiths, weavers, potters, and cabinet makers. They lived in squalid huts, furnished with a stool or two and perhaps a wooden bed. The men wore short kilts, and the women coarse linen shifts. The children ran about naked, and everyone went barefoot. These people worked from sunup to sunset, the unskilled at back-breaking physical labor, and the skilled at making delicate jewelry, fine linen, inlaid furniture, and exquisite pottery for Pharaoh and his nobles. But despite their long hours of work and their lack of creature comforts, the poor of Memphis, and of all Egypt, seemed to have been a merry lot. The valley was warm and sunny. The river teemed with fish, and as far as archaeologists can tell, the poor had few complaints. They went about their business cheerfully, relished their diet of fried fish, garlic, and coarse bread, and enjoyed the good strong beer of Egypt whenever they had the chance. Beyond the dockside quarters of the poor, the alleys widened out into the shady, tree-lined streets of the city's upper-class residential section. Here lived Pharaoh's nobles and the high-born officials who served him up and down the valley. Their houses were enclosed by high brick walls, and each had its own pool and garden, where pet gazelles picked their dainty way among the flower beds, and brightly colored birds sang in the acacia and sycamore trees. The lords and ladies of these elegant dwellings lived their lives in service to Pharaoh. Each morning they breakfasted on fruit and light wine, and then dressed themselves with care. The men wore heavy bib-like necklaces of gold and precious stones, and linen kilts, buckled around the waist with a jeweled clasp. On their heads they placed thick black wigs, and on state occasions they wore thonged sandals. Otherwise they went barefoot. The women's preparations for the day were more elaborate. They painted a green line below their eyes, darkened the lids with black makeup, rouged their lips, and stained their finger and toenails red. Their clothing consisted of an almost transparent linen sheath and nothing else. They, too, wore long black wigs and necklaces, bracelets, and anklets of gold and jewels. Archaeologists think the ancient Egyptians first wore wigs to shield their heads from the valley's hot sun, and that eye paint was used as a protection against the sun's glare, but whatever their origin, wigs and eye makeup had become high fashion by Cheops's day. The royal precinct where Pharaoh's lords and ladies spent their days was almost a city within a city. Just inside the gates of its high encircling walls stood the great royal storehouses. These were a noisy complex of cattle yards, granaries, and warehouses, full to overflowing with the taxes paid to Pharaoh each year by his people. Coined money was unknown in ancient Egypt, and tax payments were made in flax, wine, honey, grain, beer, and livestock. Close by the storehouses was the great royal treasury. Here an army of scribes worked busily all year round. These men were a vital part of Egyptian society, and their importance was to increase as valley life and government became more complex over the years. Scribes were graduates of the temple schools, where they had learned to read and write. Some went on to serve the public. For a catch of fish or a length of linen, they could write a letter or record a business transaction for a client. Others worked in the households or on the vast country estates of the nobles, keeping their accounts and records. Some became teachers, and many hundreds worked in Pharaoh's employ. Those in the great royal treasury spent most of their time bent over Pharaoh's tax lists. They kept track of taxes due, wrote out receipts for taxes paid, and checked incoming payments of produce and livestock through to the storehouses. Here is a statue of a superintendent of an ancient Pharaoh's royal granary with his wife and child. Right here is a royal scribe, his papyrus scroll open on his lap. And here is a brewer straining mash. Beyond the bustling commercial section of the royal precinct was the quiet temple area, where Pharaoh worshipped daily. Many of Egypt's gods had temples there, but not all, for the valley people worshipped hundreds of deities. They ranged from obscure little village gods to the great creators of the world. There were gods of the sun and moon, of good and evil, of hearth and home, of wisdom and love, of death and resurrection, gods of all sorts and kinds. They personified everything the Egyptians wondered about or feared or hoped for. Reigning supreme over this multitude was Ra, the great god of the sun. Bright banners fluttered from the flagpoles that stood before each of the precinct temples. Within, priests moved gravely about their duties. A privileged few busied themselves in the most sacred part of each temple, its inner sanctuary, or Holy of Holies. Here was kept the image of the temple god, sometimes a golden statuette, more often a painted wooden figure with movable arms and legs. Each day the priests bathed and anointed these images. Then they changed the god's clothing and placed before him offerings of meat, fruit, and cakes. Magic, it was believed, would enable the god to absorb the essence of the food. Not far from the temples was a park-like area of shade trees, ornamental pools, and brilliant gardens. Here were the palaces of the royal family. All were light, airy buildings suitable to Egypt's hot, dry climate. The palaces were furnished simply but richly, with gauzy linen hangings and chairs, tables, and couches made of precious woods, inlaid with gold or ivory. Nearby were the palace cookhouses, where the royal chefs worked over their roasting pits and brick ovens, preparing the roast duck, roast beef, grilled gazelle steaks, and sweet cakes that grazed Pharaoh's table. Cheops conducted most of his governmental business from his imposing, pillared audience hall in the royal precinct, ably assisted by his nobles, his officials, and his vizier or prime minister. But once a year he boarded his great royal barge to make an inspection tour of the kingdom. Sailing north and then south from Memphis, Pharaoh voyaged majestically from the delta to the borders of Egypt. He noted the condition of the country's irrigation systems. He visited existing temples and commissioned his architects to draw up plans for building new ones. And he paid a state visit to the 20 or more provinces into which his land was divided. Each of these provinces had a name: the province of Jackal, the double scepter, and the point of the two fishes, for example. And each was governed by one of Pharaoh's nobles, known as the first under the king. It was the responsibility of these nobles to administer justice in their localities, to oversee the fields and the livestock, to maintain the area temples, to repair and enlarge their irrigation systems. And they also collected the taxes due Pharaoh each year from their districts and shipped them on to the great royal treasury. His inspection tour done, Cheops almost certainly made one more port of call before returning to his capital. 10 miles downriver from Memphis, he would have dropped anchor for a day or two to see how work was progressing on the giant tomb he was building for himself. The tomb known today as the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Egyptians first started to build with stone about 100 years before Cheops was born. Before then, their buildings had been constructed of wood and of bricks made from the Nile mud. When first used, stone was laid as flooring in a few occasional tombs. Then, about 80 years before Cheops' time, Pharaoh Zoser came to the throne. Royal tombs in Zoser's day were rectangular. Here, an Egyptian serf was plowing behind a team of oxen. Nobles often placed models like this in their tombs, believing that magic would bring the serf and oxen to life in the next world, where they would continue to work for their master. So royal tombs in Zoser's day were rectangular, flat-topped structures made of brick. They're called mastaba tombs, after an Arab word meaning bench, which is what they resembled. Pharaoh Zoser, knowing that brick crumbled in time, desired a tomb for himself that would last for all eternity. And so his chief architect and vizier, a remarkable man named Imhotep, conceived the idea of building his lord's final resting place entirely of stone. Imhotep ordered limestone to be quarried from the valley cliffs and cut to the shape and size of bricks. With these stone bricks, he built a huge mastaba. On top of it, he placed a smaller mastaba and then a smaller one on top of the second In all, there were 6 mastabas, one on top of the other. They rose more than 200 feet into the air and looked like a giant staircase. This tomb, known as the Step Pyramid, was the first significant structure in the world built entirely of stone, and it was the first pyramid built in Egypt. Only 80 years later, the valley people had become so skilled in the working of stone that they could conceive of and erect the Great Pyramid of Giza. And they constructed it not with little brick-shaped pieces of stone, but with giant 2.5-ton blocks. Archaeologists know that most of these huge blocks of granite were quarried on the spot from the cliffs behind the pyramid. They also know that the polished blocks of limestone that sheathed the outside of the pyramid were cut from the cliffs opposite the pyramid, on the other side of the river. This limestone was transported across the Nile during the inundation each year when the flood waters enabled heavy barges to maneuver up to the base of the cliffs. Archaeologists know, too, that a permanent crew of about 4,000 expert stonemasons and sculptors worked at the site all year round. Traces have been found of the barracks where they lived. An additional workforce of some 95,000 men worked on the pyramid each year during the 4-month period of the inundation. This was a time of enforced idleness for Egypt's farmers since their fields lay covered by the Nile floodwaters, and so Cheops gave them employment and fed and housed them in the bargain. Historian James Bakey calls this the first unemployment scheme on record. Archaeologists think that Herodotus was not far from the mark when he wrote that it took 1,600 talents, about $3 million in modern money, at least when this book was written, probably much more at this point in time, to pay for the radishes, garlic, and onions it took to feed these conscripted workers during the 20 years the pyramid was being built. The barracks of the permanent workforce were close to the river. Nearby were the landing stages where the great blocks of stone were unloaded. A causeway of hard-packed stone and rubble led inland from the landing stages to the base of the pyramid. The giant stone blocks had to be transported along the causeway to the pyramid and in some way hoisted into place up dizzying heights as the pyramid grew. But how was this done? The only tools and equipment the pyramid builders possessed were chisels, copper saws, ropes, measuring tapes made of knotted string, sledges, and rollers. They had no wheeled carts or wagons. Of any kind. Here is a picture of the giant Sphinx. This is between Pharaoh Chephryn's pyramid tomb on the left here and Pharaoh Cheops's Great Pyramid of Giza on the right over here. They had no cranes, no block and tackle, no lifting equipment of any sort. Herodotus, unreliable though he often was, unfortunately had nothing to say about the actual techniques used in building the pyramid. And no records of tomb paintings have been found that describe or show how the work was done. Over the years, archaeologists have advanced many theories about how the great stones were raised into place. One, and surely reasonable, theory holds that, first of all, the huge blocks of stone were unloaded and dragged to the workshops near the riverfront. There they were measured to size with knotted strings, then cut to shape with copper saws. And when each stone was ready, it was bound around with ropes and levered up onto rollers or a sledge. A crew of 40 men was then harnessed to the ropes like horses. When the order was given, they strained forward in unison. They tugged and pulled, bent nearly double, until at last the great stone rocked and moved forward. Inch by inch, the men dragged cut granite up onto the causeway and along the causeway to the base of the pyramid. This causeway, so the theory goes, connected with 4 ramps built flat against the sides of the pyramid and slanted steeply upward from ground level. Like the causeway, the ramps were made of hard-packed rubble and stone. Up them The 40-man crews dragged each of the more than 2 million blocks of stone that went into the body of the pyramid. When the core of the structure was finished, the ramps completely hid the pyramid from its base to its apex. Next, the limestone blocks that sheathed the outside of the pyramid were dragged one by one to the top of the structure. Now the work proceeded downward. As each course of limestone was laid, the ramps were lowered one level. When the entire pyramid had been sheathed and the workers had reached the ground level, the ramps had been destroyed and Giza stood forth in all its shining majesty. Close to Cheops's pyramid stood row upon row of mastaba tombs, built by Pharaoh's nobles, favorites, and officials. They were clustered close around the resting place of the god king they hoped to serve in the next world, and they had served him as they had served him on earth. Not far from the mastaba tombs stood the pyramid of Cheops's queen. Nearby was an empty stretch of desert and a great outcropping of tawny rock. Here Cheops's son and heir, Chephren, would one day build a pyramid almost as big as his father's, and he would order his sculptors to transform the rock's outcropping into a giant sphinx, a sphinx with the body of a lion and a portrait head of Chephren himself. Like the great pyramids, Chepren's sphinx has endured over the long centuries. Today, as it did more than 4,500 years ago, it stands in the shadows of the pyramids of Giza, gazing sightlessly out over the Nile toward the rising sun. Bless you. In the year 1924 of the present century, a group of archaeologists was excavating among the mastaba tombs around Cheops's Great Pyramid. Quite by chance, in an ancient quarry nearby, they stumbled on the blocked-up entrance to a shaft that had been tunneled down into the rock. The archaeologists stopped everything to explore the underground passage. It slanted down into the darkness for a distance of 85 feet and then came up against a stone wall. With infinite care, the excavators pried out one of the stones and stared into pitch-black space beyond. One of the men lit a candle, thrust it into the opening, and caught his breath. By its flickering light, he had glimpsed a large white alabaster sarcophagus and the glitter of gold. The rest of the wall was hastily removed, and archaeologists crept into the musty underground room. The white sarcophagus stood against the far wall, and the floor in the front of it was littered with broken funerary equipment, alabaster and gold jars, pieces of gold leaf, gold lion's paws, and pieces of rotted furniture. One of the segments of gold leaf was covered with hieroglyphs. Using tweezers, the archaeologists gently lifted it up and read, quote, "Mother of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, follower of Horus, guide of the ruler, favorite lady whose every word is done for her, daughter of the god of his body, Hetepheres." End quote. Hetepheres. The archaeologists, who were huddled together in the underground room, stared at each other in disbelief. Hetepheres, the mother of Cheops, had been buried in her own imposing pyramid at Dashur, just upriver from Cairo. Here's the canopy, bed, and chair of Queen Hetepheres, reconstructed from fragments of gold and wood found in her secret burial chamber. Here is her hand mirror, made of gold and polished bronze. And here is her, the queen's crown, showing the sacred cobra, or Uraeus, ready to strike out at any who dared attack ancient Egypt's royalty. Archaeologists had found her tomb empty and had assumed that it had been robbed in antiquity. How did this great queen's sarcophagus come to be hidden away in a crude underground chamber in Giza? With as much haste as their exact science allowed, the archaeologists worked to clear the room of its shattered but priceless treasures. Reaching the sarcophagus at last, they broke its seal, pried the heavy lid upward, and found the coffin empty. This was an old story to archaeologists. Time and again, they had discovered ancient tombs only to find their sarcophagi empty and their funerary equipment gone. For in spite of the awe felt by all ancient Egyptians for their god kings, The riches buried with Pharaoh were too tempting for the unscrupulous to resist. From the unification of Egypt down to the end of her history, thieves had broken into and robbed the royal tombs, no matter how impregnably they were built or how cleverly their entrances were camouflaged. The disappointment archaeologists at Giza guessed that this is what had happened to the mummy of Queen Hetepheres. During Cheops's lifetime, they theorized, thieves had broken into her pyramid at Dashur. They had stripped the queen's mummy of its priceless jewels and then burned her body. For if the queen's body were destroyed, her spirit, or Ka, would be unable to haunt or take vengeance upon the violators of her tomb. The terrified guards at Dashur had resealed the sarcophagus and then reported the theft to Cheops. In a fury, he ordered his mother's coffin and funerary equipment removed to Giza. There it was to be temporarily reburied, while Cheops built her a new pyramid. And so a shaft was hastily tunneled into the quarry rock, and Queen Hetepheres' sarcophagus was lowered, unopened, into the crude little chamber below. Her funerary equipment was dumped in after her, and the shaft was sealed off. It was never disturbed again. Possibly Cheops died before he could build a new and fitting tomb for his mother. In any case, he almost surely never knew that her body had been destroyed, a desecration that would have filled him with horror, as it would all Egyptians, for the destruction of a dead person's body ended all hope for eternal life after death. Certainly Cheops never knew that his own great fortress of a tomb at Giza would be broken into in much the same way, not by modern Arabs, as archaeologists at first supposed, but by his own people. This was to happen not long after Cheops's death, when ancient Egypt sank into a period of near anarchy and despair, a period that archaeologists have called her Dark Ages.